Okay, so we're going to be moving on to the endocrine system. Let me start the show here. Okay, and so we're jumping all the way, jumping 17, page 662. And this is because Ms. Bano and I thought that it's really important in 203 to talk about the two control systems. Because it's hard, actually it's hard to talk about any system without talking about the nervous system and endocrine system, because these are the control systems, these are the communication systems. So we really need to get those two down, and we spend most of the rest of the semester doing that. And so we move it up, and then when we get to 204, if you take me, you'll see that I have to say that 204 is a little more difficult than 203 because you got to remember how the endocrine system and the nervous system works. Because we're going to go through the respiratory system, the digestive system, the urinary system, and they're all controlled by nerves and hormones. So so this is something you really need to. So the tests and things aren't comprehensive, but there's stuff control things are sort of things you got to really remember. So this is a big, important chapter. Okay. Cell-to-cell communication systems. There's the way cells communicate with each other. They send molecules to each other. That's how they communicate, right? And the molecules bind to receptors on what we call target cells. And this is really how the nervous system works and how the endocrine system works. They have similarities and differences that we'll get to later on. The similarity is they send out signaling molecules. Cell-cell communication systems, we talked about gap junctions. These are really electrical synapses, and there's not really signaling molecules. That's kind of so I got to backtrack that a little bit. That's just ions traveling from one cell to the next. And one cell excites another cell because ions go through holes in the membrane. So that's not really signaling molecules. But neurotransmitters, paracrines, and hormones are. And right now we're just going to, and the differences between those three signaling molecules is how far away the receiving cell is. Really. For neurotransmitters, they're really close to each other in a chemical synapse. Paracrines, the signal molecules are sent out of the cell and put into the neighborhood from neighboring cells. Hormones are sent through the entire body. They're called systemic hormones, as opposed to paracrines, which are sometimes called local hormones. They're just put in the neighborhood, but a hormone, a systemic hormone, goes out through the entire body. But remember, it only affects certain cells, cells that have a receptor for it. These are called okay, look at this. Target cells. That's a target cells. All right. And then the endocrine system versus hormone-producing organs. Now, when we get to hormones, so talking about hormones, we're going to find out that just about every organ in your body secretes a hormone. Things that you never think about, like the heart secretes a hormone. Kidneys, they secrete a hormone. Adipose tissue, even skeletal muscle secretes a hormone. Liver secretes a hormone. There's all kinds of, like I said, just about every organ and tissue secretes a hormone. So why is in your whole body the endocrine system? Well, that's because the endocrine system, the cells in endocrine organs, that's their primary role. Matter of fact, that's their only role, is to secrete this hormone. That's it. So So that's what I put into the endocrine system versus hormone-producing organs that are all other places in the body. So we're going to look at the endocrine system, but we're also going to talk about, this is what's called the endocrine system, a chapter. We're going to deal more with just the endocrine glands. We're going to deal with other hormone-producing organs. And in other chapters, we'll talk about those hormone-producing organs also. Okay. Then there's endocrine versus exocrine. Remember in the tissue chapter, we looked at two different kinds of glands. Ductless glands, which are endocrine glands, and ducted glands with ducts, and that's exocrine. And so we dealt with those in the tissues chapter. Now we're going to deal with endocrine glands, ductless glands. Right? And then endocrine versus nervous. They're both signaling systems. So there's a similarity, and there's a point on page 664 is comparing the endocrine system and nervous system features. One thing is how close the target cells are. As I mentioned, the secreting cell is real close to the receiving cell in the nervous system in a chemical sense. There could be other sides of the body for the endocrine system. Speed of delivery. Usually nervous system is like really fast. Nervous system is like email. The endocrine system usually, not always, but usually is a little more relaxed, a little slower, more like the US postal system in getting messages where they're going, right? Sort of a relaxed state. It doesn't have to be quick. That's when we get to the reproductive system, we'll learn that. That's mostly controlled by the endocrine system because, it can be relaxed there. Okay. Let me. So as it says on page 64, communication methods, endocrine system secretes hormones, nervous system secretes neurotransmitters. Target of stimulation, any cell in the body with a receptor for the hormone, nervous system, other neurons, muscle, and gland cells. Response time, relatively slow. As I mentioned, endocrine, rapid response time, usually in nervous system. Range of effect, typically, endocrine system has typically wide-ranging effects on the body. Range of effect in nervous system is more localized. Duration of response, endocrine system could be really long-lasting. Minutes to days to weeks. Duration of response usually short-term, milliseconds in a nervous system. All right. Okay, so here's a little comparison here, and this is like on the previous page, comparing nervous system and here's a neuron, and sends an action potential down here, and here's where the secretion occurs down here. Neurotransmitters onto these target cells. These target cells are usually other nerve cells, muscle cells, or gland cells. Here, the endocrine gland secreting hormones into the blood and it travels throughout the blood, goes to target cells that could be pretty far away. Now these, in the nervous system, the target cells might be really far away. As I mentioned, I'm moving these muscles right here, and there's these muscle cells are quite a ways away from the nervous system where the signal is coming from. And that could be true for the endocrine system also. And here are the target cells down here, and here, these are target cells if they have a receptor for the hormone. So systemic hormones, every cell in your body is exposed to these systemic hormones, but the only ones that respond to it are ones that have a receptor for it. Because the receptor is a protein. Of course, that's coded for by a gene. So every cell in your body has receptors for every hormone. but do they make that receptor? Do they express that gene and make that receptor? Only some do, and therefore they are the only target cells. Okay, so what you're going to need to know in this chapter is you're going to need to know the endocrine system and also other hormone producing organs, and you're going to need to know the name of the hormone, the chemical type of the hormone, what are the target cells for the hormone and where they're located, and what the hormone actually does, its physiological effect. I know it's a lot, but this is the nature of the beast here. Okay. Functions, lots of functions, endocrine system. Maintaining homeostasis of blood composition and volume. That's important. Controlling reproductive activities. As I mentioned, reproduction is largely controlled by hormones. There are some neuroresponses for erections and things, but mostly it's hormonal. Regulating development, growth, and metabolism. There's lots of metabolic hormones. Some of them are made by your GI tract. And speaking of GI tract, controlling digestive processes is there's pretty much every part of your GI tract makes a hormone. Well, stomach does, and intestine does. Large intestine, not really. But okay, location of endocrine organs. There's sometimes endocrine cells in other organs. These that make the hormone. For example, in the pancreas, it's largely an exocrine gland, but it's got little islands of cells, or islands of Langerhans, inside the pancreas. And that's part of the endocrine system. They are endocrine cells. They make hormones called insulin and glucagon. And those are, like I said, so the pancreas is really an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. There's the major endocrine glands, and then on the left, and organs containing endocrine cells on the right. And that's not a complete list at all. There's lots more, but those are major ones. Right. So major endocrine glands, sometimes those glands are actually within the nervous system. So there's some structure called neuroendocrine, because they're really part of the brain and part of the nervous system, but they secrete a hormone. At the pineal gland, it's actually a brain structure. And and then the pituitary gland, which is a dual gland, part of it's glandular, part of it's actually nerve tissue. So it's neuroendocrine. Half of it is. Thyroid gland, near your larynx, the adrenal glands on top of your kidney. And that's really it as far as the major endocrine glands go. Then organs containing endocrine cells, the hypothalamus. This is a brain area that secretes what are called releasing hormones. The skin, I said the thymus, the heart, liver, stomach, pancreas, small intestine, kidneys, and gonads. They all have endocrine cells in them, and they all secrete a hormone. And that's not even a complete list, as I mentioned. Practically every organ in your body secretes, but those are the major ones we're going to go over in this chapter. Okay. How do you stimulate the secretion? So how do you cause an endocrine gland to secrete the hormone? Sometimes one hormone will stimulate the secretion of a second hormone. And sometimes that second hormone stimulates the secretion of a third hormone. So that's called hormonal. Thyroxine is a good example. There's the thyroid gland makes thyroxine. It's stimulated to do that by thyroxine stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. And we're going to see that that's TSH. And then we're going to learn that the secretion of TSH from the anterior pituitary is stimulated by TRF, thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So like I said, one hormone stimulates the secretion of the second hormone, and that second hormone stimulates secretion of a third hormone. Humoral, that's blood. Something in the blood stimulates the secretion of hormone. And insulin is a good example of that, because the cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, these are called beta cells, they detect blood glucose themselves. And if the blood glucose gets too high, insulin will be secreted. And then a lower blood glucose, and then the insulin will be stopped. So those cells are sensitive to something in the blood. In this case, it's glucose. Nervous. Sometimes nerves stimulate the secretion of hormones. And a good example of that is epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. See, the adrenal gland is a dual gland also, has a cortex and a medulla, and they both secrete very different hormones. And there's a sympathetic pathway that goes directly, that go directly to the adrenal medulla when you get nervous or anxious or afraid or excited, and that stimulates the cells in the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine or adrenaline. Okay. Well, there's the three types of hormonal stimulation, release of a hormone in response to another hormone. Humoral stimulation, release of a hormone in response to changes in the level of nutrient or ion in the blood. And nervous system stimulation, release of a hormone in response to a stimulation by the nervous system. Now, chemical classes of hormones. So you need to know a little bit about these. And they really fall into three categories: steroids, proteins, and biogenic amines. Steroids are lipids. They are fat soluble, they're nonpolar, so they have to be carried around in the blood by these protein carriers. Cortisol is a good example of those. The sex steroids, sex hormones, are another good example of steroids. Proteins, polypeptides, oligopeptides, glycoproteins. Oligopeptide just means a short protein. These are hydrophilic hormones. They do mix with water. And one of those, and there's lots of these. The example is parathyroid, but there's a bunch of other ones. All of the ones from the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary proteins and other releasing hormones of proteins. There's lots more protein hormones than there are steroid hormones. We learn, though, that the steroid hormones and protein hormones, they interact with their target cells in different ways that we're going to get to later on in this chapter. And then there's biogenic amines. And they, like norepinephrine, which is actually a neurotransmitter as well. And they're derived from some amino acids, I think. And some of them are polar, and some of them are actually non-polar. Norepinephrine and epinephrine, I think, are polar, but I think thyroid hormone, I think, is a biogenic amine. I think it's non-polar. But anyway, we'll get to those. Okay. So there's steroid hormone. Lipid soluble, formed from the cholesterol. Oh, that's right. Cholesterol is the most basic steroid. And all the steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol. So cholesterol is a very important molecule. It's important for cell membranes. It's also important to as a starting material for all steroid hormones. So got a bad reputation for clogging arteries, but it's an important molecule. Protein hormone, water-soluble, consists of amino acid chains, 3 subgroups: polypeptides, oligopeptides, and glycoproteins. Polypeptides are very long proteins. Oligopeptides are short proteins, and glycoproteins have sugar attached to them. Biogegamine, water-soluble, except for thyroid. So I didn't remember that correctly. They're water-soluble except for thyroid. They're derived from amino acids. Okay. So local hormones and paracrines. So talk a little bit about local hormones. And these are called eicosanoids. And they're derived from a phospholipid called arachidonic acid. They can do autocrine or paracrine stimulation. This is odd sometimes, but sometimes there are cells, and it's particularly one in the immune system we'll talk about, that secretes a paracrine that stimulates itself. That's called autocrine. But usually, they stimulate nearby cells, like I said, in a neighborhood. That's what a local hormone or paracrine is. And they fall into 3 categories: leukotrienes, which are immune proteins. And we're going to talk about a few important ones in the immune system. Prostaglandins, which are involved with inflammation, so that's part of the immune system too. But also the contraction of smooth muscle in prostaglandins will do that. And the thromboxanes, which are clotting proteins. And as a matter of fact, these are made also from the essential fatty acids, the omega fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6. So that's why those are important. That's why fish oils is so healthy, because it's got lots of this omega-3, which is hard to find in our diet. Okay, well, there's all the functions right there. Inflammation, immune system signaling, that's true for leukotrienes and prostaglandins, smooth muscle contraction, prostaglandins, blood clotting, thromboxane. And stimulation of pain receptors, I left that one up. That's prostaglandin too. And that's why actually aspirin works, because aspirin inhibits the production of prostaglandins. Okay, so there's the, well, that's where I just mentioned about aspirin. I forgot about this one coming up. So arachidonic acid from a plasma membrane phospholipids. And steroid drugs block here. That's one thing about steroids that they do. They inhibit the immune system. And that's sort of how they do it, because they inhibit the production of arachidonic acid, so they can't make the leukotrienes. And then over here, you don't have to know these particular enzymes that convert arachidonic acid to leukotrienes, prostaglandins, and thromboxanes. But here's where aspirin blocks right here. So it blocks the production of prostaglandins and thromboxane. That's why also aspirin inhibits blood clotting. So people take low-dose aspirin as what they call blood thinner. I don't like that term because it doesn't thin your blood. It's an anticoagulant. Okay, hormone transport. As I mentioned before, fat soluble has to be bound in protein carriers because it's, your blood plasma is a aqueous solution, and lipids don't dissolve in it. So it has to be put into a protein carrier that's hydrophilic on the outside, hydrophobic on the inside. And so you can talk about bound and unbound steroid hormones. And of course, they have to be unbound before they get attached to the receptor on the target cells. So they have longer half-lives, they last longer because they're not filtered in the kidneys. And some hormones that are filtered in the kidneys are destroyed by the kidneys. Small proteins actually get through the kidney. through the glomerulus and are destroyed. So, protein hormones won't last as long as steroid hormones. And the water-soluble ones, remember, are all the biogenic amines except for thyroid hormone. And all of the protein hormones are all water-soluble. And so they don't need carriers. They get dissolved in the blood and are part of the plasma protein fraction. Okay, blood levels. Balance between synthesis and destruction. So you make the hormones and then you destroy the hormones also. They're limited by kidney. As I mentioned, some are small enough to actually get through the filtration membrane in the kidney corpuscles. The liver also breaks down hormones. And the target cells, once they bind to the receptor, the target cells themselves destroy the hormones. So like I said, you want this hormone to do its job, and then once it's done its job, you want to get rid of it. Okay, target cells interaction, fat soluble. So a hormone has to bind to a receptor to do its job. So it forms these hormone receptor complexes. For fat soluble, it's inside the cell. The receptor for fat soluble hormones is inside the cell. And the fat soluble hormone just dissolves right across the membrane of the cell. Right? But water soluble has to bind to a membrane protein. It doesn't enter the cell. And so you have what's called a signal transduction pathway, where the hormone is the first messenger. And then the hormone stimulates a protein on the inner surface of the membrane called a G protein. That stimulates an enzyme called adenylate cyclase, which makes a molecule called cyclic AMP. And this is the second messenger. And that second messenger activates protein kinases that cause a cascading phosphorylation that leads to an effect. So it's much more complicated. The interaction with target cells is much more complicated for water-soluble hormones. Okay, target cells' degree of response. Number of receptors, up and down regulation. So the response of a hormone, the response of a target cell to a hormone is dependent upon how many receptors it has. And if it really wants a big stimulation, it will upregulate, make more receptors. If it's being overstimulated and doesn't want to be stimulated, it'll make less receptors. Where it's under control because it makes the receptors. It copies, expresses genes that make those proteins, those receptors. And then receptor interactions. There's three. This is the way hormones work. Different hormones may work in the same organ. Some of them are called synergistic. They both do the same thing. Estrogen and progesterone. They stimulate the endometrium, the lining of the uterus, preparation for the implantation of a blastocyst. So they work together to do that. Permissive is one first acts, and then the other one can act. So like one sets the scene, the other one comes later and does the job. Prolactin and oxytocin, and this is for breastfeeding. Prolactin stimulates the breast to make milk, so it's storing milk. But in order to reject the milk, you need oxytocin. That causes milk, what's called milk letdown. That's stimulated by an infant suckling at the breast. So they work together also, but one has to work first and then the other one. Antagonistic is they do exactly opposite things. Insulin lowers blood glucose, glucagon raises blood glucose. that's antagonistic. And that's all I'm going to. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more with this slide, but in the next video lecture. So this one's going to be 203 endo1. Okay, I'll catch you on the flip side here. Let me stop recording. Where is it?